Welcome to a little bit of London that is forever Jaipur.
Dear friends and lovers of literature, here we are again with JLF at the British Library 2021.
It's a particular pleasure for me to come back to the British Library, which has been my office in London for many years, and where my books have all been written and researched, and it's very nice to see this end of my life sort of double back on it.
Our amazing writers, today more than any time, because of the way the digital age has taken over, we need you to be able to make sense of the past, divine the future, and perhaps set in context what we're going through at this very point of time.
Do you feel that Britain and India can best intersect culturally?
Well, we've been intersecting for a long time. It's not that we will have to intersect. If you look at our cultural and historical relations, we go back a long way.
That may be nations or cultures or religions or sexualities, class, culture, gender, race, all those things, that distance is somehow reduced or bridged because we're connecting at a very basic human level.
I believe in the ability to convey meaning by the written word is our superpower.
Hi everyone, welcome to this session with Dr. Edmund Richardson. We're going to be talking about his book, Alexandria, the Quest for the Lost City. Welcome, Ed. Such a pleasure to speak with you today. And thank you to everyone who's joining, giving a Saturday afternoon in India and Saturday morning in the UK, I think, to this wonderful book. I think you've made the right choice. Welcome, Ed. It's really nice to have you here.
It's wonderful to have a chance to talk. Thank you so much.
I'll just start off by saying that when I got the chance to read this book, it was sort of, it felt like something, like a gift, because Charles Masson is the kind of figure who I encountered when I would read about Kabul. He would sort of pop up in the most unexpected places, but quite persistently. And, you know, he was up to all kinds of things. And I eventually stopped following his trail, but he was always someone I wanted to know more about. So I was really pleased to get my hands on your book. And of course, it's a wonderful feat of archival research. There's also beautiful layers of what does it mean to be in the throes of this grand obsession. We're talking about Afghanistan at a really tumultuous time in the country's history in the present. And I hope we'll have the chance to talk a little bit about that. But to start, Ed, I'd like you to start from your beginning, which is how did you encounter Masson and what led you to write this book about him?
It's probably a story of falling down the rabbit hole, as a lot of books are. You kind of come across this character and then you kind of come across him again, and then before you know it, you're, in my case, sitting in a terrible motel outside a small town in Pennsylvania, trying to decipher the story of someone's adventures in Afghanistan, or wandering around archives and getting lost in all these kind of Victorian spy reports. So it was, for me, a kind of moment of my eyes getting open to a new world, which is, I think, one of the things that, you know, a wonderful book always tries to do, and maybe in some ways I've possibly tried to do here, which is this guy, Charles Masson, who wanders off from his regiment in the East India Company one day and just falls headlong into honestly one of the strangest stories I'd ever heard of. As a wandering traveler for years, a spy, a beggar by the roadside, someone who takes tea with kings, and then the scholar who makes this fantastic discovery in Afghanistan. I just found myself falling for him and wanting to know more about him. And every time I found out something more about him, the story got stranger, which I always think is a good sign of a good story, right? The closer you look, the stranger it gets. And the closer I looked for Masson, the stranger his story got. It became from this kind of footnote in 19th century archaeology, this guy who made a few dusty discoveries which have been sitting in museum storerooms. It sort of grew and grew and grew until it became this tale of, you know, how we go in search of the past and the dreams we have about the past, and how those change the way we see the world and change the way people write history and think about the ancient world, as Charles Masson in the end managed to do.
Yeah, and that partly what makes him, like you said, so you know, frustrating and interesting a character to write on, I imagine, is, as you say, that most of the stories about him may or may not be true. Can you tell us a little about how you know, how you approach the writing of this book, actually?
So I quickly realized that everything I thought I knew about Masson was just this autobiography he wrote, which looked very tidy, very neat, had lots of dates in it, was incredibly boring, actually, but it's one of those like bits of 19th century scholarship where you're like, okay, well, I can mine this for details and I can sort of figure this out. Then I realized that after a bit of research that almost everything he wrote in his autobiography, including the first sentence, was actually made up. And then I was like, okay, hold on a minute, this is not going in the way I expected. I was like, okay, fine, I'll find some scholarship on Masson, and then I looked at pretty much everything everyone had ever written about him. I was like, okay, everything, including my own first article about him, has at least one major error on the first page. So I was like, okay, what am I doing here, and how do I get to the bottom of this? Which kind of made it intriguing, you know. This is someone who's very good at convincing people that he's a certain kind of person. He's very good at playing the part of the earnest Victorian scholar. And he's so good at playing it that he suckered basically every single person who's tried to write about him for a century and a half, including very much myself. And so I gradually realized that this is a story that I had to piece together one document at a time, one piece of evidence at a time. So I sort of went stumbling around the world of every time I could get a little bit of money together, I'd sort of jump on a plane and end up in a, one obscure archive after the other, looking at these kind of records of Victorian spies and archaeological discoveries and the East India Company getting up to no good. And eventually I began, at least I hope, to figure out what was true and what was false about him. But to be absolutely honest with you, ever since the book has come out, I've been kind of waiting to get an email one day saying, okay, the following 28 things are wrong. But I guess I was trying to write a story which sort of lent into the ambiguity and the tall tales, and kind of acknowledged that so much of history, so much of our writing of history is also storytelling. It's the writing of sometimes rather tall tales. And certainly almost everything we know about Alexander the Great is incredibly dubious. So I was trying to sort of tell the story of one dubious character's search for another, sort of Charles Masson's search for Alexander the Great, and two kind of storytellers each trying to outwit one another, if you like.
Yeah, and this is the really wonderful thing about the book, which I mean, separate from the whole sort of Charles Masson story, is in your book you've managed to enmesh both these characters, Alexander and Masson together. And like you said, they're both trying to outwit each other. So there's this wonderful sort of cat and mouse game that they're playing across all these centuries, and we get to see it through your book. So for people who haven't read the book and are listening, the search for Alexander's lost cities was one of Charles Masson's great obsession, or it became his great obsession. And I love the fact he was, correct me if I'm wrong, but almost entirely self-taught, and everything he discovered was just fueled by this grand obsession that he developed with finding these cities. Could you tell us a little about this big sort of passion in Charles Masson's life, and how did he arrive at this from being a deserter from the army to this place?
So yeah, random deserter from the British East India Company, wandering across the desert, almost starving to death, almost broiled. This doesn't look like someone who's about to change history, let alone make any big archaeological discoveries. Masson is not from a rich or well-connected background. He's an ordinary working class boy. He's almost entirely self-taught, but over the years, he spends wandering on his own through northern India, through Afghanistan. He develops this obsession with Alexander the Great, and he sees a very different version of Alexander to the kind of conquering, swashbuckling, uncomplicated imperialistic hero that a lot of kind of Western scholarship at the time saw in Alexander. Masson sees someone who's as far from home as he is, and who's kind of as alone as he is, kind of just this sort of solitary man keeping warm by a fire on an Afghan hillside. And he just falls incredibly hard for Alexander. There's also an element of self-interest here, right? If this deserter can find a lost city of Alexander the Great, then at the time this is a world-changing discovery. This is something that could make his name, that could like change his life and give him possibilities and opportunities which otherwise in a very kind of class-bound 19th century society are simply not going to be available to someone like him. So the obsession becomes all-consuming, and there's this lovely word in ancient Greek which historians often use to write about Alexander called pothos, which basically means it's a longing so great it just bursts your heart open and sets it on fire, and this desire for the impossible. And Masson develops, for want of a better word, this pothos for Alexander and for finding the traces of Alexander in Afghanistan. Now, of course, deciding you want to find a lost city is kind of the easy part. It's what you do next when you're like, well, okay, so I've got all of Afghanistan. I might be able to get a shovel, but I have no idea what to do next. So actually finding this lost city, actually telling Alexander's story becomes his sort of life's obsession, the thing that he devotes year after year to while he's living in Afghanistan.
And part of the reason why I really enjoyed the book was how deeply he felt for Afghanistan as well, and his love for Kabul. And from in the time you describe his first arrival at Kabul, you say he felt at home in this city. Could you read a bit from your book, maybe talking about this, his relationship with this place?
Absolutely. So yeah, he falls so hard for Kabul. He's been wandering alone for years, and he's felt kind of out of place all his life. He's this incredibly sort of scholarly young man who keeps on hoping to find a better life and keeps on hoping to be sort of seen, if you like, but he never really does until he reaches Kabul. And so this is from a little bit after he first arrives in Kabul. In the winter months, the people of Kabul retreated indoors and wrapped themselves in heavy sheepskins. Wine froze and copper vessels burst during the night. In spite of the bitter cold, Masson was happy. No one knew whether he was a traveler, a spy, or a madman, and no one cared. There are few places where a stranger so soon feels himself at home and becomes familiar with all classes as at Kabul. There can be none where all, he wrote, so much exert themselves to promote his satisfaction and amusement. He must not be unhappy. To avow himself so would be, he's told, a reproach upon the hospitality of his hosts. I had not been a month in Kabul before I had become acquainted with I know not how many people, and become a visitor at their houses. Muslims, Christians, Jews and Hindus lived side by side, eating together, celebrating together, and walking in one another's funeral processions. They mutually attended each other's weddings and participated in the little matters which spring up in society. A Christian would offer gifts to his Muslim neighbor on Nowruz, the Islamic New Year, and in turn he received them on his own Christmas Day. Kabul in 1833 was one of the most tolerant cities in the world. Kabul, in fact, was almost aggressively tolerant. When any of the city's Christians sought to convert to Islam, they used to be interrogated by the vizier, who would ask the unfortunate convert what they had discovered of evil in their own faiths that they were anxious to change them, and would upbraid them as worthless, unprincipled fellows. Masson spent his days wandering Kabul. The city's bazaar was one of the wonders of Asia. Mohan Lal, an Indian scholar, was not easily impressed. He had grown up amidst the wonders of Delhi, but Kabul's bazaar left him awestruck. The parts of the bazaar which are arched over exceed anything the imagination can picture. The shops rise over each other, and steps glittering in tinsel splendor, till from the effect of elevation, the whole fades into a confused and twinkling mass, like stars shining through clouds.
Thank you so much, Ed. It's a particular time that your book also addresses. It's, there's so many characters floating around, like Josiah Harlan, there's Alexander Burns, Mohanlal, who you just mentioned, and they're all sort of entangled in this web of ambition, of espionage, in Charles Masson's case, possibly reluctant espionage. But can you tell a little about that context that he was operating in? And within this, he was trying to engage in archaeology, which also carried a specific meaning at that time.
At the time, Afghanistan was essentially becoming more and more tangled up in the power plays of larger countries, larger empires surrounding it. There was the British East India Company sort of slowly extending its influence north. There was the great Sikh empire of Ranjit Singh centered around Lahore. And there were the Russians sort of gradually moving east and south through Central Asia. And Afghanistan becomes this extraordinary hub and crossroads of adventurers and drifters and dreamers and hopeful mercenaries and, from traders to kind of fortune hunting Americans trying to, there's a man called, as you say, Josiah Harlan, who sort of wanders off into Afghanistan hoping to make himself a king. It doesn't go very well for him, as you might expect, but it's a place of possibility for so many people. It's a place where they feel they can become different people to the ones the 19th century kind of would allow them to be elsewhere. And from all across the world, people gravitate towards Afghanistan, hoping that this will be a place where they can rewrite their stories, where they can emerge as different people, and where they can perhaps make a name for themselves in ways that they could not in the rest of the world. And for Masson, unfortunately, his past catches up with him as a deserter from the East India Company. So the East India Company promptly blackmail him into becoming a spy for the British. So he's this very reluctant sort of British agent in Kabul. All the while he's trying to explore the traces of Alexander's lost city, which he finds buried beneath the plains of Bagram, about 40 miles from Kabul. So he's kind of switching between excavations one day and sort of sneaking around Kabul and listening to the city's whispers the next. Of course, archaeology at the time, as you said, is something rather different to what it was today. And archaeology at the time was unfortunately not something a practice where people were aware that it was important to kind of have respect for the context of finds and the culture in which finds came from. It was often a quite sort of bluntly extractive enterprise where Masson wasn't the only person wandering around Afghanistan trying to find traces of its past. And compared to some of the sort of smash and grab expeditions, he was, relatively speaking, sort of interested in finding out more about the country's past. And he finds some astonishing things. He finds tens of thousands of pieces of Afghan history from the time of Alexander the Great to the Buddhist era to the recent past. And he does this while with a death sentence from the East India Company hanging over his head and sort of never quite knowing how he'll pay for his next meal or quite how he'll manage to get through the next few days.
So can you sort of locate Masson's actual achievements in the sense that what was it that he actually told us about this place, and how does that sort of match up with his relative obscurity in this field?
He shows us one really important thing, which probably today we would take for granted, but in the 19th century and the 1830s was something weird and new and very unwelcome in many quarters. He showed us that cultures in the ancient world, and indeed throughout the centuries of Afghanistan's history, East and West, Greek and Afghan, pagan and Buddhist, cultures and religions didn't sort of sit behind high walls yelling at each other. The narrative of Afghanistan's history wasn't really just a story of East versus West or European versus Afghan. Indeed, that story just didn't work at all. What he found was cultures learning from each other and reaching out from each other. He's found Greeks who became obsessed with Indian scholarship and philosophy. He found the earliest datable image of the Buddha, which is this remarkable golden casket, and on it the Buddha's dressed like a Greek and flanked by two Hindu gods. He found Afghan kings who were sort of depicting themselves like Roman emperors and writing in Greek, while also being incredibly serious Buddhists. He found that cultures twined around each other and learned from each other, and that was just the way history had worked. And of course, for British audiences in the 19th century, who were very keen to think of the way cultures interacted as us versus them, East versus West, who were very much moving from a version of British imperialism which could acknowledge that earlier that Britain needed to learn from the world, to this later 19th century version of British imperialism where it was just all about a hierarchy of cultures. It was about a very kind of brutal us versus them idea of Western superiority and enforcing that by any means possible. This idea that Alexander the Great's expedition in Afghanistan had not left these kind of Greek cities scattered through Asia, but had left this incredible fusion of cultures and ideas and identities, and of Greeks who were much more interested in learning from the world than they were in making it Greek. Well, this was just heresy. This didn't work at all. And this was actually kind of discomforting and bad. So Masson's finds got basically buried. They all sat gathering dust in cabinets and drawers at the British East India Company. And they just basically disappeared. They weren't catalogued until the late 20th century in the British Museum. And, you know, tens of thousands of his finds just disappeared. No one knows what happened to them. Even just a few years ago, like hundreds of Masson's coins, his finds in Kabul, just turned up randomly in the British Library. No one knew where they'd been. No one knew they were there. They just, oh yeah, here's a few hundred more of them. So like this side, the story he tries to tell gets just basically buried, wiped from history, because it just makes so many people so uncomfortable at the time.
Yeah, that's so interesting. And you mentioned the East India Company, which of course is a huge player in the region, and they played such a big role in how the history of the region was defined, was inventoried, was understood. Do you want to talk a little bit about how the role they played in Charles Masson's story?
So he's on the run from them, obviously. He's a deserter, he's an ordinary soldier. They don't take kindly to that. He knows for years if they catch up with him, he will be put to death in probably a very unpleasant manner indeed. So he lives in fear of them for years, and then finally his past catches up with him. And he naively thinks that if he does spy for them, he will be able to at least kind of bring the British and Afghan worlds closer together, bring them, sort of help the East India Company understand a little bit about Afghanistan, because the level of just absolute lack of knowledge of Afghanistan in Britain and in the British East India Company at the time was astonishing. There's just only a handful of British people had ever traveled to Afghanistan. There were no accurate maps. Indeed, the most widely read source on Afghanistan for the British at the time in the 1830s was the histories of Alexander the Great, written by a Roman historian called Arrian, who had never set foot in Afghanistan himself. So that kind of tells you just how little people knew at the time. There's a lack of knowledge combined with an utter certainty that that they knew what they were talking about, which of course is a rather deadly combination. And the arc of Masson and the British East India Company is essentially of this warmth and this, very, very positive relationship between Afghanistan and the West. The ruler of Afghanistan, Dost Muhammad Khan, wanted to form an alliance with the British. Masson, as a wandering Western traveller, was welcomed everywhere he went and given hospitality on the road in Afghanistan for years. There's this absolute sense of warmth and a wishing to make Masson welcome, wishing to ally with the British on the Afghan side, which is met by, I'm very sorry to say, the British decision to invade Afghanistan, to depose Dost Muhammad Khan, to put sort of a ruler of their own choice on the throne, which leads, of course, to the complete breakdown of the relationship between Afghanistan and the East India Company, which leads to the disastrous First Anglo-Afghan War, where of the thousands of East India Company soldiers who marched into Afghanistan, only a couple made it out without being killed and taken prisoner. The British decision to invade Afghanistan just breaks Masson's heart. He resigns his appointment as spy. He's like, I don't really, he was like, I just don't care what happens to me now. I just can't have anything to do with this horror. It breaks his heart. It basically drives him into just utter depression. He spends months kind of holed up in a little house in the poorest part of Karachi, just drinking and weeping and feeling that the world he'd lived in, the place he had felt, was the closest to home he'd ever been, had just been swept away. He tries to get back to Afghanistan during the British occupation, just wandering there on his own, but he gets caught up again in a rebellion against the British, and when he finally extricates himself from that, he's imprisoned by the East India Company as a Russian spy. They think he's a Russian spy. I don't know why. Suffice to say that most of the people put in charge of Northern India by the East India Company were not exactly very bright. But he almost starves to death. He sort of it breaks him. So eventually he sort of gets out of that and finds his way back to England, keeps on trying to get back to Afghanistan, but he never can. He never forgives the East India Company for destroying the relationship between Afghanistan and the West, and the East India Company never forgive him for telling him for him telling them how badly their attempt to invade Afghanistan would go. So yeah, it is not a good relationship, shall we say the least, between the two of them.
That's, yeah, I mean, so many questions for you, Ed, but I'm just going to take two other questions from me and then move to the audience questions, which also has some really interesting things to ask. Very quickly, reading through your book, of course, there's so many interesting characters, including Afghan characters who were you tempted to write more about them, like Mohanlal, or who's Indian, of course, but Akbar Khan, or even Charles Masson's friend, who also assists him in excavations. And also I was very struck by how male this world is. There are barely any women mentioned. Could you tell us a little about this aspect of the research?
That's a really good question. And I think as historians, we have to be conscious of whose voices we're centering and whose voices we're not. And I kept on hoping for kind of better archival strokes of luck than I had, and being able to really center women's voices and center Afghan voices more fully. Because one thing I was incredibly conscious of is how important both Afghan women and Afghans were to Masson's archaeological project. Most of his excavations are, in fact, run by Afghans. There's a friend of his, a collaborator of his called Hassan, who, after the first few months, is running almost all of Masson's excavations in Bagram. Masson is sort of stuck in Kabul trying to be a spy, and almost all of the excavations are run independently by Afghans. There's a wonderful moment where another British traveller approaches kind of one of Masson's excavations, one of Hassan's excavations, I should say, and attempts to sort of play the kind of Westerner marching in and taking control, and Hassan just says, "Go away. You're not seeing this. No, you're going to have nothing to do with this. You're going to keep walking, sir, and maybe you'll get to see something that we found later on." Masson's excavations are to a large extent bankrolled by Afghans, particularly by Afghan women. He's hugely in debt to several women in Kabul at certain points, and he's one of his closest friends is the son of Dost Muhammad Khan, the ruler of Afghanistan, Akbar Khan, who later achieves fame by leading the Afghan resistance to the British occupation. One thing I found quite challenging was that I couldn't find enough sources in these people's own voices to really center them as fully as I wanted. And one that I kept hoping for the kind of one of the historians I most admire, William Dalrymple, had this wonderful thing in Return of a King and in almost all of his works where he'll say in his introduction, "I stumbled across this bookshop and this gentleman gave me these armfuls of manuscripts." And I was like, "Oh, let me find that bookshop. Let me find." So I feel these voices are out there, and it's really important to, and one of the things I want to try to do in subsequent work is find ways to center them much more fully and much more effectively, as Dalrymple's done, and as you have done so wonderfully in your work in Kabul. It's just the kind of writing I only dream of being able to do.
That's very kind. Thank you. Of course, it's different for journalistic work or nonfiction now, but I can well imagine you're sort of waking up every day and hoping to find that treasure trove of voices. just one last question from me, and then we'll move to the audience questions. Is a lot of talk these days about Afghanistan sort of takes this idea of this time of history repeating itself. And do you feel that this is something that we should bear in mind, or is it an oversimplification of a really complicated region?
I think obviously history never quite repeats itself, and the cliche of Afghanistan being a graveyard of empires is, like most cliches, doesn't really have that much going for it. You sort of see the, and even in just the case of Alexander the Great, you see many of the Greeks who settled in Afghanistan just thriving and becoming, you know, falling head over heels for Afghanistan and for the culture, far from being just disappearing from the historical record. But then you have these coincidences, of course, like Bagram, the site of Alexander's lost city, being this incredible archaeological site where you have these layers of Alexander's city, then the layers of the empires which followed it, and then the remains of many of the British soldiers who were fleeing Afghanistan in the 1840s, who camped in Bagram. And then, of course, on top of Alexander's city and the remains of the British forces, you have Bagram Air Base, you have the ruins of Soviet tanks, you have the wreck of the current American expedition. Masson himself, when he was writing later in life, sort of dreaded the idea of history repeating itself. He wrote this coda to his own life story. He said, "It's to be hoped that the good sense of the British nation will never again permit such expeditions as the one beyond the Indus, so into Afghanistan, to be considered with levity and to be conducted with recklessness. And the experience acquired from disasters may be made beneficial in placing affairs in very different hands from those who've so willfully abused the power confided to them, whose rashness and folly in plunging the country into wars ruinous to its reputation may yet be punished." So whether or not we see history repeating itself, it's certainly something Masson spent a lot of his life afraid of.
Thank you so much. I'm going to take you now to what, let's see, Lisa's asking. The legacies of explorers were often tied to the glory of empire and funded by the state or the crown. Though Mason's expeditions began with the rejection of state, he ran right into its web and compulsions. Can individual pursuit and academia ever escape the judgment, policy, and propaganda of state?
Such a wonderful question. Thank you so much. I think you're right. Archaeology is power, obviously, and who gets to tell stories and who gets to, you know, have control of artifacts of the past is obviously incredibly bound up in power plays, in issues of state and of empire. And I don't think history's stories of the past can ever quite escape power plays in the present, I think. History writing indeed is often a form of power play in the present. And we can see that in a lot of Masson's contemporaries in the East India Company, who often wrote so obsessively about the ancient world in order to justify their own imperial adventures in the present day. One of Masson's contemporaries, a diplomat called Alexander Burns, used to call himself the second Alexander, which is obviously, you know, obviously the first was Alexander the Great, so not a modest fellow this, but it's a way of claiming a sort of mantle of greatness, or indeed of sort of higher purpose to what was often sort of brutally extractive and capitalistic imperial endeavor. It's a way of saying, oh, we're in pursuit of greatness. Well, actually, no, you're just there to loot quite often. That's just all that's actually going on. So yeah, I think you're right. I think we have to think about the power and the powers behind the stories that get told and the ways in which the past is presented to us. Thank you so much.
Sonal asks, much like Marie Antoinette, Masson has to his name an infamous though dubious dialogue, which is one I really love as well. If any fool this high samooch explore, no Charles Masson has been here before. The truth of his life is precarious, but do you believe he craved the glory and recognition of an explorer?
He always dreamed of it. He always found it slipping away from him. That's kind of why I used that word pothos, the word the Greeks used to talk about Alexander's dreams, his pursuit of some impossible thing about Masson. Because the thing about pothos is it's not just a desire that takes you over, it's a desire that can never be satisfied. And Masson always found that the glory he sought, the dreams of greatness he hoped for himself, always slipped away from him. He along with archaeological expeditions, he was fond of writing truly terrible poetry, and he scribbled this line of verse on the back of one of his documents. It was a sort of go home and be lowly again, saying to himself, you know, give up on your dreams, give up on your hopes. It's never going to happen. And he kept telling himself that, but he could never quite reconcile himself to it. So yeah, I think you're absolutely right in saying that he always wanted to be Charles Masson the Great, but it never quite worked for him. It always ran away from him the closer he got.
That's such a great way of putting it. Sherna asks, can you tell us a little about Alexandria and how it came to be founded?
Thank you so much. So Alexander founded not just the one Alexandria in Egypt, but over a dozen. Some historians think, you know, as high as, you know, 40, 50 cities all across his empire, all called Alexandria. And some of these cities were grand metropolises like Alexandria in Egypt. Some of them were kind of essentially fortified army camps. Some of them were basically places to settle some of his veterans, people who are too old or too badly wounded to keep going. So Alexander settles this city with several thousand of his veterans. And it seems, as far as we can tell, it thrives for a while. It starts to grow, and we start to see an increasing kind of cultural fusion taking place, where the Greek ideas and culture intermingle with local Afghan ideas and culture and religion, so that, you know, a couple hundred years later, we see, for instance, local Afghan rulers dressed in you know, Afghan costume and Afghan clothes being depicted on coins, but the inscriptions are in ancient Greek on one side and in Afghan script called Kharosti on the reverse. So we see this kind of gradual fusion of Greek and Afghan ideas and cultures. So, for instance, in the Buddhist era, we see this wonderful story of a giant pilgrimage of up to possibly 30,000, 40,000 Buddhist monks who set out from Alexandria and went their way all the way down through India to one of the great stupas in Sri Lanka, crossing the straits to Sri Lanka. And so Alexandria is clearly a sort of center of culture and learning and ideas and trade. Even 1,000 years after Alexander founded it, we have a Chinese traveler writing of it, this sort of refuge on the road, rich in fruit trees set beneath the mountains. So it thrives in many ways, and in many ways you might not expect for centuries after Alexander's death.
That's really wonderful. I'm afraid we don't have time for any more questions, except maybe this last one where Neil Paul from the wonderful Tertulia bookshop is asking if there's any chance of this being made into a movie.
It would be quite a tale, wouldn't it? I'm open to offers, shall we say? I would love it if it could become a movie. The strange thing about Masson is that he leaves tens of thousands of words about him, and other people write tens of thousands of words about him, but no portrait of him survives. So his likeness has always been this kind of this indefinable X in my head. So the idea of actually seeing Masson portrayed, you know, with an actual face, with actual features, as an actual person would be quite surreal for me. But I'd love a version of this story if you know, if that is what ends up happening. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ed, so much for that wonderful session, and thank you to everyone who joined us. I hope you'll all get the book and read it, and have a wonderful weekend. Thank you.
Thank you so much.